starting this time of year and in through the summer slump months that we go through in the fescue belt, I get a lot of questions as the state beef nutrition specialist about trying to do what we can to support optimal calf growth among our cow herds. And a very natural question that comes up regularly is about creep feeding and, basically providing some supplemental feed that's available only to the calf and not to the cow as a means of stimulating some weaning weights and things along those lines. So what I'd like to do today is just provide a little bit of educational content about what I see in the literature in terms of creep feeding and how that might apply to your farm. So for me, creep feeding really comes down to 4 key points, and that's the feed conversion ratio, which is the pounds of creep feed that you feed to an animal divided by the pounds of additional calf gain that you get off of the creep feed relative to a calf that was not fed creep feed. The second is the value of that gain that you put on those animals. The third is how much it costs to put that gain on those animals. And then really the last thing I want to kind of wrap up is I get a lot of comments and feedback from producers that it's their belief that creep feeding spares condition on the cow. The cow maintains better body condition. But I'm going to show a couple slides of data that would suggest that that's largely not the case. This is a study that was done in southeast Kansas on K31 fescue pastures. Calves were offered either creep or no creep. They were offered creep for 120 days, which might be a little longer than what we would do today. Traditionally, what we might see today would be somewhere between 60 and 90 days of creep. The creep fed calves gained about 118 additional pounds relative to the non-creep control. As you can see here, the difference between the 511 and the 393 pounds. And so another way of expressing it, the calves that were creep fed, they gained about almost 0.35 pounds of weight more per day than the calves that were not fed creep. But to put it in context, over the 120 days of creep that they fed these calves or offered creep feed to these calves, the average calf consumed 1,013 pounds of creep. They fed them 1,013 pounds of feed to get an additional 118 pounds of gain. You divide the 1,013 by 118. Essentially, it took 8.5 pounds of creep feed to get an additional pound of calf gain. Now, I chose this particular study because it was done in the fescue belt, and there's other examples from other parts of the country. It's eerily similar what we see in terms of creep feed to gain. We'll see anywhere from 6 if it goes really well and 10 if it goes really bad. So 8's kind of a nice middle ground number, I would say, to plan on. So if you're trying to put a pencil to creep feeding, what is the value of that additional weight gain that you put on the calves? And so I like to relate that back to a cost of gain number. What's that worth? So our previous slide, we had a feed to gain of 8.5. Okay. Now, for easy math in this example, let's assume that feed costs 10 cents a pound. That's $10 a hundredweight or $200 a ton. Your feed cost to gain is 85 cents. So essentially, you put 85 cents of feed into that animal to get an additional pound of gain. Now, understand that when I talk cost of gain calculations for a background or a feed yard, for anything like that, our cost of gain will include is the cost of the feed, cost of yardage, or essentially the labor and overhead for the facility, any medicine or interest costs. So when you look at that 85 cents, it's not necessarily a whole cost of gain, that's just the feed cost of gain. Now, let's put that in context for the average cow-calf producer who doesn't necessarily look at a lot of feed yard or backgrounder cost of gains. In terms of cost of gain standards, typically backgrounders or stockers, where they try to angle themselves or position themselves in the marketplace, is that they're trying to essentially be able to put weight on light calves cheaper than a feed yard can. Okay, and so the historical rule of thumb is that if you can put weight on a calf for 2/3 the price of a feedlot cost of gain, you're in pretty good shape. And so that puts you in the 55 to 60 cent range. Now, Kansas State publishes every month something called the Focus on Feedlot Reports, which is essentially closeout data or animal performance data from a number of large feed yards out dispersed throughout the state of Kansas. The most current month that they have published is March of 2020. The cost of gain was 83 cents per pound for steers and 87 cents for heifers. Okay, so that includes feed, yardage, medicine, and interest and everything. So from my perspective, the example that I showed you here at an 8.5 feed to gain and 10 cent per pound feed, that 85 cent cost to gain is not a terribly good economic decision because you haven't added any of the overhead costs into it as well. But to put it in even bigger context, I think you have to understand not just the cost of gain is, but also what the value of gain is. Okay, so every week, the Missouri Department of Agriculture publishes a weekly market summary. And I have shamelessly stole a screenshot out of a recent one and put on the slide here. The easiest way to get to this PDF document is to simply Google Missouri feeder cattle summary. And you can see that this is the average across the state. This isn't for individual sale barns. This is just an aggregate of steers and heifers. So let's look at a steer example first. And like I said, this is a recent one. Now, in this case, I assume that we are essentially going to creep feed a calf, and we might take them from 527 to 573. I'm just using their numbers. I'm assuming we're going to creep feed for a shorter period of time than they did in that older study. We're going to put 46 pounds on those steers. Now, when you factor in the value next to the steer, that's the price per hundredweight. And so when you factor in the value of the animal if you sold them at the time, so 527 pounds times 1.78 against the 573 by $1.65, you take into account that price slide, which in this case is about nearly $13 a hundredweight. The difference in the value of those animals is about $14.79 or 32 cents per pound of weight gain. And so we really don't see the value of gain is upside down relative to the cost of gain, at least in this example for steers. Now, if you look at the heifers, let's assume that heifers are inherently a little lighter than steers. We're going to take heifers from, let's say, 474 to 522. Now, you'll notice right offhand the difference in the price of the 474 versus the 522. There's no difference. The price per hundredweight is the exact same in both examples. And so that value of gain is going to be much higher. Okay. If you look at it, the value of gain is essentially $1.54 a pound or $74 in gross revenue. So that in this example, at least, the heifer, it looked like it made sense for, but the steer, it did not. Now, one of the big limitations of using value of gain to make calls like this, should I creep feed, should I not, is that you might be looking at a value of gain report from a period of time that's in the past relative to when you would sell these cattle later on. And so you're taking a look back and trying to predict the future based on past performance. We can do that to a certain extent, but certainly nobody saw COVID-19 coming or any other things like this. You have to understand the inherent limitation of trying to look at a value of gain today and predicting or projecting what might be in the futures. Don't assume that it's always going to help heifers and it's always going to be against steers or anything like that. This is just an example of how you put it together. So now let's kind of tackle that myth in terms of creep feeding and sparing condition on a cow. So this is a paper that was done at the University of Illinois a few years ago. What they did was they measured the amount of creep feed, the amount of forage, and the amount of milk that a calf consumed in a day's time. So essentially, what's really interesting about this, if you think about a calf, they have three sources of feed in this example: forage, milk, and then when you add creep, they have creep. Now, they fed them either no creep, pound and a quarter a day, 2 pounds a day, or nearly 3.4 pounds of creep per day. What's interesting is you'll notice that forage intake decreased pretty substantially, and as you replace it with creep. However, the milk production in the cow, the milk consumption by the calf didn't change at all. Okay. And so you might take a little bit of pressure off of a pasture, but you're certainly not going to take any milk production pressure off of a cow in this case. Now, in this case, these cattle were fed creep for 56 days. They measured milk production every 14 days. And this is an average of essentially 4 milking dates. It's interesting if you look at the forage intake, so the forage plus creep on a pound of creep a day, you sum the 8.36 and the 1.28 together, you actually end up with a number higher than the original forage, the control, which was 9.02. But once you get into the medium and high levels of creep, you're at 7.7 and you're at 5.5. And so the calf is actually consuming less total nutrients, total calories, total pounds of protein, etc., if you put them on a high creep diet because you're replacing that forage with creep. Even if the creep is of higher nutrient quality, especially if you were to have a 50% reduction in intake, it's highly unlikely that you're replacing a forage that's low quality enough that would be a positive. So let's look at this in the context of this is a separate experiment, but was in the exact same paper. So the citation is the same, but it was a separate experiment. And so in this case, they fed calves or offered calves creep feed for 0, 28, 56, or 84 days over 2 years. During that period of time, cows lost between essentially 19 pounds and 50 pounds. All of them lost weight. And you'll notice there was no difference in body condition score across any of those treatments. So there were no statistical difference. So the actual weights went down, the body condition scores. There was no separation among the treatments. And so, really, that idea that creep feed spares condition on a cow is a myth. Now, if you use it to increase calf weights, that's fine. It makes sense in some cases where you either have good feed to gains or you have cheap access to cheap creep feed, basically. But I think those considerations are important to keep in mind as you make the decision here the next few months. If you've got a spring calving herd and you want to make the decision whether or not you should creep